Hey everybody! So today we are going to be talking about the asteroid Chariklo. I want to talk about her because she was Chiron's wife in mythology and also like a friend and aid of Vesta and Pallas. Now, what is known about her through in mythology isn't really known about her specifically. It's more what we know about her tends to come from what we know about Chiron and her relationship, along with what we know about her and Pallas and her and Vesta. It's less about her. So what we do know about her and how to kind of read this asteroid does come from these other sources, if you will, which does make her mythology a little harder to pin down, especially her origin story. But before I get into that, I do want to mention that the asteroid number for this, to find it in the asteroid databank on astro.com, the number is 10199, and she was found on February 15th of 1997. Now to start out, she was her origin story is kind of all over the place, or I've seen different things said by different sources. I've seen it mentioned that she was a water nymph, that she was a shapeshifter, that she was a centaur herself, like Chiron. I've seen it mentioned that she was a shapeshifter who turned into a centaur. Like, any of those could be possible, and I don't know. It doesn't really matter, I guess, so much what it is. I do like it when I can actually nail something down. But because if you think about all of those possibilities, she is kind of in a state of flux or in a state of transition. And it's been thought that she is healing for people who are in a state of flux or in a state of transition. And this makes sense because, I mean, even if she's a shapeshifter, right? Like, there is transition that happens there. Shifting from one thing to the other. If she was a centaur, there's transition there, right? Because you've got, half of you is human, half of you is horse. So that's also like a transitional energy too. Even where she falls in her orbit, right? Like in the sky. She's between Saturn and Uranus. So that's transitional too, going from the inner to the outer planets. So there is a transitional energy to her, and there is a healing energy to her. There definitely is. So it does seem to suffice that she would be very healing for those in a state of flux or in a state of transition. I think that's pretty apt. So that's one way that you could work with her. Like if you felt like you were specifically going through some kind of change, she might be an asteroid that you might want to tap into. And how you would tap into that would depend on the sign, what area of life by house, and, of course, the aspects made. Another big one for her, another thing that she supposedly has a lot to do with are boundaries. There are a couple of reasons that I can think of for this. Her orbit, I mentioned before, was, she falls between Saturn and Uranus. She is closer to Uranus, but she's between, the inner and the outer planets. Chiron is between them too. But Chariklo, her orbit never veers off into Uranus's orbit or Saturn's orbit. She stays in her lane essentially. So she knows boundaries in that way, right? There's an understanding of that in that case. Also, though, she was like a friend or an aide to Vesta. And, not just anybody could enter Vesta's temple. Not just anybody was allowed. Not just anybody was allowed to know Vesta. And Chariklo did. Now, Vesta to me is about boundaries in that sense. So it makes me think that Chariklo must have known them too. She must have at least understood them. So in looking at it from this lens, this asteroid probably does deal with boundaries. And this could be like your own boundaries, or even how you deal with other people's boundaries. If you're somebody who feels like their boundaries are constantly walked all over or ignored or whatever, Chariklo might be a good asteroid to work with. Or if you're somebody on the flip side of that that feels like you completely ignore other people's boundaries. Nobody really wants to admit that, but if you think that could be possible, she also might be somebody, and she also might be an asteroid to work with in that sense too. But definitely enforcing, and it's like in a healthy way. It's in a tactful way. It's in a grace. Her name means graceful spinner. So there's a grace to it, a grace to the way that she does things. So this isn't like enforcing boundaries in like a nasty way or in a rude way, but enforcing boundaries all the same. And letting it be known what you will or will not do, what you will or will not tolerate. Doing it in a graceful way, but making it known and not apologizing for it. That seems pretty apt for her as well. Now, I took notes. I'm making sure I'm hitting on everything. She was also close with Pallas. And Pallas, Pallas was diplomatic for the most part. She did do some things that maybe weren't so, but for the most part, she was diplomatic. She's creative intelligence. She is wisdom. And she was very close to Chariklo. So that does make me think that for Athena to have fucked around with her, Chariklo probably had to have similar traits or similar, at least an understanding of those things. And I think this could be one of the reasons why Chariklo kind of gets the the wise woman archetype. And I think it does fit here in this case. But again, doing it with tact and with grace. Perhaps more grace than, Athena tried to be, or Pallas tried to be, diplomatic, but sometimes it was a little more ferocious or even masculine than I think of Chariklo handling things. As I mentioned in the Pallas video, I think I mentioned it, Pallas should really, the goal should be to kind of blend the masculine and the feminine. But I'm not sure that always happens with Pallas. Sometimes you can have Pallas that's, overly masculine. Or say somebody overly identifies with the masculine part of Pallas. And then I think of Vesta, who is also friends with Chariklo, or, an 8 or whatever, who's very, very feminine. And there's something about Chariklo being friends with both of them, or being close with both of them, and falling in the middle, that she does feel like she has a way to balance the masculine and the feminine too, probably more naturally than Pallas does. And I say that because to me, Chariklo is very feminine. She is feminine, but there is like a balance. There does feel like there's a little bit more of a balance with her, natural balance, if you will. But yeah, if there's anything like needing to say balance the masculine and the feminine in your chart for whatever reason. And when I say masculine and feminine, I'm not talking about genders or sex. I'm just talking about energy. Chariklo might be a place to look. I would also definitely look at Pallas too, but Chariklo would be another one to look at for these sorts of things. She was also, as I mentioned, the wife of Chiron. Now, Chiron was wounded. His original wound came in childhood, when he was abandoned by his mother, and then raised by Apollo. So that abandonment was the original wounding for him. And then of course he was wounded again when he got hit with a poison arrow, and it wouldn't heal. So he has 2 woundings in his life, but he did start out wounded. So that makes me think that anybody who is going to be with Chiron is going to have some sort of gifting for dealing with that, dealing with wounded people, perhaps. Like there's something about that with Chariklo, of being understanding, perhaps of other people's wounds, being healing for other people's wounds. There's nothing to really back up that she actually did heal Chiron, But just, I mean, think about it. When you're married to somebody, or when you're with somebody, if they're wounded, the spouse is, if you're a decent spouse anyway, you're going to try to help them with their wounds. You're going to try to understand them. You're going to try to love on them, you know. If you're a shitty spouse, you won't do any of this. But if you're, you know, so I do feel like there is something about that here with Chariklo. Trying to, being understanding, being healing in that kind of way, or being healing in an understanding way, perhaps. Just, there's also with her, you know, there's not a whole lot said about exactly what she did, but she, you know, she did support Chiron through, you know, the things that he did. So there is a sense of being a dutiful wife or spouse that comes into play here. Not because you feel like you have to. That might be a shadow of it, of Chariklo. But because you want to. So there is something also going on here too with this energy. Let me see if there was anything else. Something that people have mentioned is that perception of reality might come up with her. I could see this, especially since, you know, she is between Saturn and Uranus, but I don't know that that's necessarily strictly to her. I also feel like Chiron could bring this perception of reality into play too, or any of the centaurs. I kind of feel like they could, any of those could, but I wouldn't rule this out as perhaps playing in and pushing beyond what is traditionally perceived. Because again, you're going from Saturn to Uranus, from the inner to the outer planets. What's known, what's unknown, that kind of thing. It does seem likely. But I don't pick up a wounding from her. That doesn't, you know, Chiron is the wounded healer. So I feel like with her, that wounding isn't there in the same way that it is with Chiron. But I do feel like she could help work through Chiron's wounding in one's chart. That may not, I mean, I don't know. It may not be universal, but I do think that it should be looked at. For sure. Yeah. I think that's pretty good for now. I might think more on this and talk more about this, because she's been on my mind the past 6 to 8 months, not quite a year. But I've been like working with her more and meditating on her more, and I have really felt her. And I do feel like, I don't know, in time maybe she will be thought of as more important than she's, you know, thought of now. I mean, she's the biggest, she's like, I think the biggest fucking asteroid. I think. I think she's bigger than Chiron, I know that. I don't know, I feel like she probably deserves a more important place than she gets. But yeah, if you feel like it, let me know where she falls in your chart. I will put the name and number in the description box. I'd be curious to know how you think she might play out in your own life. It's an interesting thing to play with anyway. All right, well, I'm going to get going, but I will put the information of where to find me, website, all that shit, in the description box as well. And I will see you all later.